year 1981 saw the emergence of a new doctrine in nation building. Mahathir Mohamad, who took the helm from the Malaysian father of unity, Tun Hussein On, and plotted an ambitious master plan to unite Malaysians under the banner of Bangsa Malaysia. It could have brought the nation under one roof, if not for the prevailing hegemony of ethnocentric ideologies promoted by UMNO. The political elites of Barisan Nasional went harping on the agenda of nation building, which finally stood still at Vision 2020. Hereafter, the ambiguity of nation building begins to surface. In this second part of our Agendakinis one-on-one interview with Dr. Farish Noor, we discuss the efforts that the government had undertaken and how effective these have been in realizing what many consider to be a utopian dream, Bangsa Malaysia.
Well, I think, a nation, any nation, is by definition an abstract entity. It is an artificial entity. There is no such thing as a preordained or predestined nation. Nations have to be put together through collective will. But for a nation to succeed, the idea of the nation has to correspond to some extent to the reality on the ground. You cannot, on the one hand, build, for instance, a nation like the apartheid nation of South Africa, where you have a national narrative of white dominance that goes against the reality of a society where the black Africans were the majority. So there is then a disconnect between the official narrative and the reality on the ground. Now, nations that succeed are nations where the official narrative reflects and mirrors the reality on the ground. So what is the reality on the ground in Malaysia today? Malaysia today is a far more complex society than it was in the 70s. You have a host of new urban social groupings, new youth groups. It is a nation that is far more politically savvy, far more politically educated than ever before. It's a wired up nation with almost half the population with internet access. So you're talking about a very complex society that's going to be very difficult to govern. So your national narrative has to match that complexity, has to reflect that. But instead what we've seen, is the foregrounding of one official narrative which still privileges one ethnic community and one religious community above others. And as long as this is the case, then I think there will always be this tension between the discourse of the state and the reality on the ground. And that's why there has to be some imagination. There has to be not only compromise and give and take, but above all there has to be imagination and a realization that Malaysia is no longer the same country of 1969 or 1970. This is a complex society now. And I think you need the political elite in this country, whether it's from the government or the opposition, will have to address the fact that Malaysians are no longer a politically passive or politically uneducated population, that they make very clear political demands. Now, a scrupulous form of nation building would be one which tries to reconcile these demands in one broad framework of a nation state that is inclusive, where everyone has a place. But an unscrupulous mode of governance would be to play to the sentiments of your community. So if you're a Malay politician, you just talk to the Malays. If you're an Indian politician, you only talk to the Indians. Now that, for me, is the worrying trend that I'm seeing in Malaysia today. We have all these politicians talking about, one Malaysia, united Malaysia, Malaysian Malaysia, but how many of them are really Malaysian-minded? How many Malaysian politicians live, think and breathe as Malaysians themselves? Are they Malaysians first? Or do they still put their ethnic identity first or their religious identity first? Now, as long as it's not the case, as long as Malaysian leaders do not think as Malaysians first, I don't think we're going to have a Malaysian Malaysia or a united Malaysia or one Malaysia. So the bottom line has to be that, and the only way we can succeed in doing that is by working in the direction of a national imaginary, a notion of a united Malaysia that is diverse and complex, where every citizen has a place because he or she is a citizen. So it has to be a Malaysian politics based on the notion of citizenship. Citizenship is the thing that equalizes you, me and everyone else. We all enter the political domain, we demand the same rights, we are given the same entitlements on the basis of being equal Malaysian citizens. There's no such thing as, one Malaysian being more Malaysian than another because of your race, your gender or your religion. As long as that holds, we are not going to have a Malaysian Malaysia in any way. if we look at the periods of governance of Tun Mahathir, Dr. Abdullah Badawi and Dr. Sri Najib Razak, I think if we look at all three, the one common factor is that we see three instances of top-down state management. So in other words, these are still political elites who believe that as elites, they can define the form and content of Malaysia. Now, as long as this nation-building process is top-down, then I really do not see any way in which we can create, a national narrative, a Malaysian narrative that is inclusive and representative. Simply because elites, like all political elites, will have their biases, and certain things, certain values they want to foreground as compared to others. But Malaysian society, increasingly now, in fact, is far more fragmented than ever before, and they are making very different demands. So, I think an engagement with the Malaysian people has to take place. But for that to take place, nation building has to work within the context of a democracy. You cannot have top-down nation building without democratic participation, because that's not nation building. That's just the imposition of hegemony by a ruling regime. And we've seen models like that. It took place in the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, and we all know what happened to the Soviet Union after 1989. So I think the failure of nation building in so many post-colonial elite societies is that the post-colonial elites themselves continue to govern as colonial elites. There is a tendency in countries like Malaysia and many other developing countries for presidents and prime ministers to behave as if they were the colonial high commissioner, and to act as if their own populations are colonial subjects who have no rights to respond. And we've seen this in the 80s and 90s, and I think we've seen it in the first decade of this century as well, where, even when Islam Hadari was being promoted, it was being promoted top down. In fact, I think at one point there were even suggestions that no one had the right to question Islam Hadari, if I'm not mistaken. Now, if that's the case, how on earth do you open up the minds of Malaysians by not allowing them to speak? Now, I do not see, any successful nation building coming out of this sort of governance, this sort of undemocratic, unrepresentative, basically insensitive, arrogant, top-down, patronizing mode of governance. So the sooner our politicians, whether they are in the government or in the opposition coalition, the sooner our politicians realize that they are actually accountable to the Malaysian public and that they have to engage with respect with the Malaysian public. The sooner that happens, I think the sooner we can set about, really trying to define the terms and contents of our nation. Until that happens, all we're going to have is basically just official slogans and official propaganda. And Malaysia as a nation state is, still, as a concept, is still empty. We still don't know what it is to be Malaysian.